I remember that morning, and in fact, I can never forget that morning. It was a terrifying morning. I was in the living room looking out the front window, and I saw two soldiers come marching up our driveway. And I saw at the end of their rifles shiny bayonets. They stomped up to our front door at our two-bedroom home on Garnet Street in Los Angeles and banged on the front door. It was terrifying. My father answered, and we were ordered out of our home. It was a racist act, pure and simple, and it was an unconstitutional act. I mean, you can't imprison people for their race, and that's what we were imprisoned for.
This internment of Japanese American citizens is exemplary of a moral panic that was greatly ignored by the American public. But first, what exactly is a moral panic? In the words of Stanley Cohen, a moral panic is when a condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. The panic's nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. Moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. Sometimes the subject of the panic is quite novel, and other times it is something which has been in existence long enough but suddenly appears in the limelight. And then sometimes the panic passes over and is forgotten. Following the traumatic events of Pearl Harbor, claims-makers focused on creating an enemy of society through use of emotive rhetoric and fear-based appeals. To successfully marginalize and generate public hostility towards Japanese Americans, moral entrepreneurs needed to orchestrate social consensus to believe that something must be done quickly to deal with such an imminent threat to society. Over 127,000 Japanese Americans were forced to sell their homes and businesses for a fraction of the price and move into these camps. About two-thirds of the interns were Nisei, or Japanese American born in the United States, with many of them never having even stepped foot in Japan. There were 10 camps in remote areas of 7 states. In December 1944, the Executive Order 9066 was rescinded, and the Japanese Americans were allowed to leave the camps and finally become naturalized citizens in 1952. No espionage was ever found. Though many who actually do know of this event see this as a moral panic simply because of the Pearl Harbor bombing and the Japanese becoming our enemies during World War II, the reason for this internment came from pure racism, economic insecurity from white farmers, and moral entrepreneurs attempting to capitalize on this order. According to Good and Yehuda, a basic analysis of any moral panic must account for its timing, target and trigger, content, spread, and denouement. The hysteria surrounding the aftermath of Pearl Harbor had all the defining characteristics of a moral panic. It was overreactive, largely irrational, volatile, and extremely hostile. Timing is crucial for a moral panic to catch on. For the moral panic to successfully begin, there must initially exist a heightened concern about an issue and its impact on society. With the proper social context, the claims maker is able to take advantage of the opportunity to draw on public fears and instigate instability into society.
The history of the Japanese Americans even before the internment was hostile, with the Immigration Act of 1924 which limited the number of immigrants allowed to enter the U.S. Many in Japan were actually offended by this new law since it violated the Gentleman's Agreement and created more tension between the two nations. However, the American government was very keen on keeping the racial composition of the country a certain way. This law was only revised in 1952. Also, Japanese immigrants, known as issei, could not own land, eat in white restaurants, or become citizens. However, they managed to get around this by buying land with their U.S.-born child, and many Californians were extremely unhappy by this. So, in 1920, the Californians passed a ballot to close the loopholes in the 1913 law. There has always been suspicion, even before Pearl Harbor was bombed, of the Japanese Americans. President Roosevelt commissioned Curtis Munson to assess the possibility if Japanese Americans were a threat to the U.S. He found nothing, but still the agenda was pushed. This only grew with the agricultural interest groups and politicians, since they had been long opposed to the growing presence of Japanese Americans.
Within every moral panic comes the creation of folk devils, which are individual or groups who are held responsible for the various social strains and concerns that various claimmakers utilize to create their moral panic. The creation of the folk devil is not as simple as mere identification of a group of people to target. Instead, the claims maker or moral entrepreneur opts to pursue their own agenda of waging war over a target whom they solely perceive as a threat. To succeed in their personal agenda, they must influence and shift societal sentiment and amplify the target's alleged deviance. This is done through repeated claims or factors that rob them of any positive characteristics and portray them as inherently evil.
The Japanese were easily targeted because of their race and their economic standing. Many of them were farmers on the West Coast, and the white farmers feared the competition. In 1940, Japanese-American farmers controlled about 400,000 acres of farmland. It was even stated in a newspaper, quote, "If all the Japs were removed tomorrow, we'd never miss them, because the white farmers can take over and produce everything the Jap grows. And we don't want them back when the war ends either." Unfortunately, the Japanese Americans had a different mindset, and as a marginalized group, they did not oppose the decision of the mass removal. They accepted their fate for a variety of reasons. It was an anticipated outcome of the war, and many saw the camps as a place of refuge from the anti-Japanese violence that was happening around them. Others saw their cooperation as a way to perhaps get their loved ones back from the FBI. They, interestingly enough, chose to really have no power in the situation and to merely accept their position. It almost perhaps became a part of their identity. They also did not have a voice simply because the government was really the ones who were targeting them. No one spoke out about it, especially with the context of a war happening. One of the sad things about the internment, which was a human tragedy, is that of those 120,000 people, only 3, not 3,000, but just 3, actively resisted and refused to report to the internment camp.
In addition to the right timing, Pearl Harbor was the trigger moral entrepreneurs could capitalize upon. With tensions already rising against Japan, these claims makers finally had a reason for their irrational desire to other the Japanese people. Thus, with the existence of a moral panic, society tends to overinflate their perceptions of how many actually engage in the disturbing or threatening behavior. This leads to a collective belief that the harm incurred is greater than the rationality of it, making it easy for sentiments to be blown way out of proportion.
This situation was blown out of proportion because even after there was an investigation that proved nothing, the government still decided to intern the Japanese Americans. A more statistical point is that the FBI, quote, "arrested a disproportionate number of Japanese Americans relative to their total population in the United States." Even a Western Defense Command officer admitted that Japanese Americans were initially interned on far slimmer evidence than German Americans. As mentioned before, about 2/3 of the Japanese interned were actually American citizens, yet this figure was strongly ignored. Many Japanese students and other Japanese groups vowed their loyalty to the American government after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, yet still the government ignored these claims. These points prove that even with the Japanese Americans attempting to show their loyalty, the idea that one of these people could be a threat caused the internment of the entire race, and therefore constitutes a moral panic. The media played a large role in fueling the moral panic. When looking at the language being used in newspapers, we can see the shift in tone when talking about Japanese Americans. At the beginning of the war, the Argus, a small newspaper in Seattle, argued that American-born Japanese are not enemies of the state and deserve to be trusted. However, by February 1942, the tone had shifted and did not make a distinction between American-born and Japanese nationalists. The newspaper begged the government to do something about these Japs that were everywhere in Seattle and were a danger. Politicians also played a large role in spreading the internment of the Japanese. Besides the federal government using misinformation to convince other departments, the president, and the public that the Japanese Americans were a threat, there was the West Coast congressmen that were agitated for the removal of the Japanese. California Attorney General Earl Warren was one of the first to testify in the trials to decide if these citizens were a threat. He later was then elected governor of California, and then after the war was appointed a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Even worse, these congressional hearings were only put on display to show the public that there was political backing behind this, legitimizing the decision. Even before the hearings happened, the evacuation plans had already been issued. These were literally used to confirm or elicit wider support. These hearings became broadcasted through media and print, adding to the general fire behind the internment of the Japanese. Interestingly enough, it was only really contained on the West Coast, even though Hawaii is where the Pearl Harbor bombing happened, and the population in Hawaii was really dense in Japanese people. However, this point further stresses that the internment of Japanese Americans was related purely to race and economic fear. A third of Hawaii's population was Japanese, which is about 157,000 more than all of the mainland. Yet only about 2,000 of them were actually put into internment camps, which is a much lower rate than what happened in America. The main factors of why they weren't interned was because of how economically depreciating that would have been to Hawaii, and also the logistic difficulty of transporting them to these camps. Also, the wealthy landowners in Hawaii were really dependent on the Japanese field workers to tend to their sugar and pineapple plantations. This is a prime example of how interest groups with power can deeply influence who is seen as a folk devil. The end of the moral panic finally came with the end of the war. In December 1944, Roosevelt rescinded the executive order and began shutting down the camps. With America's victory in sight, the Japanese were slowly released once they were cleared by the government. Unfortunately, the Japanese were released and simply left to figure out their lives. Only 1,300 returned to California to nothing and had to rebuild their lives. Many feared violence against them, which was quite prevalent after the release. Worse, it took the U.S. government until 1988, 50 years later, to acknowledge that a grave injustice was done, and Congress would pay each victim $20,000 in reparations. So what can we learn from this moral panic? That these are important dimensions for a moral panic to exist. Without them, the panic might not have been as prevalent. And it's not just one event that causes the panic, but it's the buildup and the accumulation from other sources, such as moral entrepreneurs. You need to look at the historical context to see where this group was before the actual panic and how their situation helped them become an easy target. This further shows that deviance is fluid and depends on the situation and context. Deviance in this situation was not micro-level, but can be attributed to structural, macro-level issues, especially in terms of taking over the economy. Hopefully, we can use these moral panics to help us understand how not to overreact or over-exaggerate a situation. Unfortunately, it seems that even with the Japanese internment camps, as a lesson, we still let these dimensions of a moral panic overtake our society and therefore marginalize a group.